Everyone inside the gym holds a strong, confident, and often completely wrong opinion about protein. The protein myth gets passed around like gospel truth, repeated by veterans to beginners without question. You have heard it stated boldly before: eat 100 grams of protein daily, no more ever. Some say you need 1 gram per pound of body weight, without exception, every single day. Others say going beyond that ceiling is dangerous, and your kidneys will eventually pay the price. Then there is the crowd saying excess protein just converts to fat and does absolutely nothing. Everyone seems totally certain, yet somehow each person is certain about a completely different thing entirely. This is exactly how fitness mythology works, and it has been working this same way for decades. It moves from gym to gym, from veteran lifter to wide-eyed beginner, slowly hardening into fact. Nobody questions it anymore because everyone already knows it, or at least thinks that they do. High reps are for cutting. Concentration curls build your bicep peak. Cardio kills your gains forever. And somewhere inside that same pile of recycled nonsense lives the 100-gram protein myth daily. The idea that 100 grams of protein per day is some kind of magical upper limit ceiling, that eating beyond it is wasteful, dangerous, counterproductive, or somehow harmful to your body's natural design. This belief has quietly shaped the eating habits of millions of people across decades of lifting culture. And a significant portion of those deeply held beliefs are simply, completely, and provably wrong today. Not slightly off, not partially true depending on some unusual context, just flat out wrong entirely. The reason these myths survive is not because evidence ever supported them in the first place at all. They survive because nobody with real credentials cared enough to actually study them carefully until recently. Protein is not just a macronutrient sitting on your meal plan. It is the most misunderstood fitness tool. Understanding what it actually does and what it absolutely does not do changes everything about how you eat. It changes how you recover, how you build muscle, and how your body handles fat loss daily. Getting this right is not a minor detail. It is the foundation everything else in fitness gets built on. So let us pull this apart carefully, layer by layer, and look at what real research actually says. The 100-gram protein idea did not come from one single study or one clear moment in history. It evolved gradually through outdated research, cultural repetition, and confident misinformation passed down through gym generations. Early nutritional guidelines were built around preventing deficiency in sedentary populations, not optimizing performance in active people. The recommended daily allowance for protein was never designed for someone lifting heavy weights 4 days weekly. It was created to prevent muscle wasting in people who never once set foot inside any gym. Somewhere along the way, that minimum number got picked up, repeated, and treated as an absolute maximum ceiling. The fitness world took a population-level minimum and turned it into a performance ceiling. That is completely backwards. To understand why protein works the way it actually does, you need to understand muscle protein synthesis fully. Every time you train hard, you create microscopic damage inside muscle fibers through the stress of lifting. Your body responds to that damage by initiating a repair process that makes your fibers grow back stronger. That repair process requires amino acids, and amino acids come almost entirely from the protein you consume daily. If you do not consume enough protein, the repair process slows dramatically, recovery suffers, growth stalls completely. This is not a theory debated somewhere online. This is basic human biology supported by decades of research. The real question is not whether protein supports muscle growth. That part is settled science and beyond debate. The real question is how much protein actually optimizes that process and where the upper ceiling truly sits. Brad Schoenfeld spent his career sitting at the intersection of bodybuilding culture and serious academic research daily. He was a competitive bodybuilder before he ever became a scientist, which gave him a rare, unique perspective. He did not arrive at this field from the outside looking in. He lived inside gym culture deeply. He believed the bro science himself first, before he started dismantling it piece by piece using real evidence. That personal background gave his research a quality and relevance that most exercise science simply does not possess. He was not studying protein as a small side note inside some larger sports performance study. It was personal. He wanted to know the real truth about what he and every serious lifter was actually eating daily. The findings that came from this line of honest, rigorous research were not what most people ever expected. The body's ability to use protein for muscle repair and growth is substantially higher than once commonly believed. Studies began clearly showing that intake levels far beyond 100 grams daily produced measurably superior muscle-building outcomes. The old belief that your body can only absorb 20 to 30 grams of protein per meal is false. The body absorbs essentially all the protein you consume throughout the day. What varies is the absorption rate. A larger meal with more protein simply takes longer to digest and absorb, but none of the protein disappears. It does not get flushed out, it does not automatically become stored fat. It gets used across a longer window. This single misunderstanding is responsible for an enormous amount of unnecessary protein restriction across gym culture worldwide today.
People split meals into tiny portions, chasing a 30-gram serving rule that was never actually scientifically real. Research on daily protein for people who train consistently points to ranges far beyond 100 grams per day. For someone doing regular resistance training seriously, evidence supports intakes between 1.6 and 2.2 grams per kilogram body weight. For a 180-pound person, that translates to roughly 130 to 180 grams of protein daily, not 100 grams. And for people in a caloric deficit trying to preserve muscle while losing body fat, protein needs increase further. This is exactly where the protein and fat loss connection becomes genuinely fascinating and consistently misunderstood by gym culture. The dominant belief in fitness spaces is that cutting total calories is how you successfully lose body fat. That part happens to be correct. The part that gets missed is what happens to your muscle mass underneath. When calorie intake drops significantly, the body begins looking for additional fuel beyond stored body fat for energy. Muscle protein becomes a primary target when dietary protein intake is too low to protect existing muscle tissue. This process is called gluconeogenesis, and it literally means your body can consume its own hard-earned muscle for fuel. The amount of protein you eat during a cut is the primary variable determining whether this muscle breakdown happens.
High protein intake during a caloric deficit signals the body to spare muscle and burn stored fat preferentially instead. This is not a subtle or small effect at all. The difference between adequate and inadequate protein during a cut is dramatic. Studies comparing high protein and moderate protein diets during caloric restriction show meaningfully different body composition results consistently. The group eating more protein loses more fat relative to muscle mass and finishes leaner with better strength retention. The group eating less protein loses total weight too, but a much greater proportion comes directly from muscle tissue loss. They finish lighter on the scale, but not necessarily leaner in terms of actual body fat percentage at all. This is the real difference between losing weight and actually losing fat. They are not the same outcome. And protein is the single most important dietary variable determining which outcome you actually experience during any cut. Beyond body composition, there is a thermogenic effect of eating protein that most people have genuinely never heard about. Of all three macronutrients, protein requires the most energy from your body to properly digest and absorb fully. This is called the thermic effect of food, and protein sits at approximately 25 to 30% thermic cost. That means for every 100 calories of protein eaten, your body uses 25 to 30 calories digesting it alone. Compare that to carbohydrates at roughly 8% and dietary fat at just 2 to 3% thermic cost. A high-protein diet creates a built-in caloric advantage that works quietly in the background all day long. You burn more calories simply by eating more protein, without changing anything else about your training or lifestyle habits. This is not a dramatic overnight effect, but compounded across weeks and months, it is absolutely real and measurable. It is one of the key mechanisms through which higher protein intake actively supports fat loss rather than hindering it. The myth says 100 grams is your ceiling. The science says more protein actively accelerates exactly the results you want. There is also a satiety dimension to this conversation that gets almost entirely overlooked in discussions about protein and fat loss. Protein is the most satiating macronutrient by a significant and consistent margin compared to carbohydrates or dietary fat. When you eat adequate protein consistently, hunger signaling decreases and feelings of fullness last substantially longer between your meals. This happens through multiple hormonal pathways, including reductions in ghrelin, the primary hunger hormone, and increases in satiety signals. In practical terms, a higher protein diet makes staying in a caloric deficit dramatically easier and far more sustainable long-term.
You are not white-knuckling through hunger every afternoon. You are simply and genuinely not as hungry as before. This is not a small quality of life improvement. It is one of the most powerful tools for long-term dietary adherence. The hardest part of any fat loss phase is not knowing what to eat. It is sticking to the plan consistently. Protein gives you a real physiological advantage in the adherence battle that no other macronutrient can match or replicate. Now let us address the fear that stops many people from eating more protein than they currently consume daily. The kidney damage argument, the persistent idea that high protein intake puts dangerous strain on your kidneys over time. This concern is not entirely invented from nothing at all. There is a kernel of real biology inside it. People with pre-existing kidney disease genuinely do need to monitor and often restrict protein intake for real medical reasons. But taking findings from a diseased population and applying them to healthy, active individuals is not science. It is a logical error. Research on kidney function in healthy people eating high-protein diets shows no evidence of damage or meaningful impairment. Studies found no adverse effects on kidney function in healthy individuals, even at intakes well above standard recommendations daily. The kidneys of a healthy person are not fragile organs being quietly damaged by eating adequate nutrition consistently.
They are highly adaptable organs that adjust their filtration rate to match protein intake over time, just like muscles adapt. The kidney damage argument, when aimed at healthy people simply wanting to build muscle and lose fat, simply does not hold. If you have no pre-existing kidney condition, eating the protein your actual physique goals require will not harm anything. This is one of those myths that sounds cautious and responsible on the surface, but causes real harm underneath. People undereat protein, fearing kidney damage, and unknowingly undermine their recovery, their muscle mass, and their fat loss results. The cautious-sounding advice turns out to be the advice that actually holds the most people back most consistently. There is a related protein myth floating specifically in the context of plant-based and vegan dietary approaches today. The belief that plant proteins are completely inferior to animal proteins and cannot effectively support serious muscle-building results. The reality here is more nuanced than either side usually admits during passionate online arguments about the topic. Plant proteins do differ from animal proteins in their amino acid profile and their digestibility and absorption rate. They are often lower in leucine, which is the key amino acid that most powerfully triggers muscle protein synthesis. But this does not mean plant proteins cannot support real muscle growth. It means you need more of them.
By eating varied plant protein sources in higher daily quantities, the amino acid gap gets effectively and practically closed. The leucine threshold needed to trigger muscle protein synthesis can absolutely be reached through well-planned plant-based eating. This is not an argument against animal protein, which remains the most efficient and complete source for most people. It is an argument against the absolutism claiming plant-based eaters cannot build serious muscle, because the evidence simply disagrees. The more important variable in almost every study comparing protein sources is total daily protein intake, not the source. Someone eating 200 grams of plant protein daily will generally outperform someone eating 100 grams of animal protein for growth. Quantity matters more than source in the vast majority of real-world training contexts at reasonable and achievable intake levels. Now, let us talk about protein timing, which is another area where mythology is dense and reality is far simpler. The anabolic window concept, the idea that you absolutely must consume protein within 30 minutes of finishing your workout. Miss that window, according to gym legend confidently repeated for decades, and your entire workout was essentially completely wasted. This idea was repeated so confidently that an entire industry of fast-digesting protein products was built entirely around it. Shakes you could slam immediately post-workout, so you would not miss the mythical 30-minute window of opportunity. The research on this is fairly clear and fairly boring compared to how dramatically the myth gets presented daily.
The anabolic window exists, yes, but it is far wider than 30 minutes, far wider than most people realize. Studies examining muscle protein synthesis rates show the elevated anabolic state following training persists for several hours comfortably afterward. The practical implication is that consuming protein within a few hours of training is entirely sufficient for most people. If you train in the morning and eat a protein-rich meal 2 hours later, you have missed absolutely nothing significant. What matters far more than precise meal timing is your total daily protein intake spread reasonably across your meals. Getting enough protein consistently every single day is a far more powerful variable than precisely timing any single post-workout meal. The timing obsession is another example of fitness culture focusing intensely on a small variable while ignoring the fundamentally larger one. It is the same cognitive error that produces the high reps for cutting myth and the concentration curl peak mythology entirely. Details get elevated to the level of doctrine while the actual fundamentals get casually treated as optional background noise.
But the fundamentals are where almost all of the real, lasting results live for almost every person in almost every context. Sufficient total protein, consistent progressive training, adequate sleep, reasonable caloric management. These are the genuinely big levers that matter. Everything else, the timing windows, the specific sources, the precise meal distribution, these are small marginal adjustments at best. Getting the fundamentals consistently right first and obsessing about fine-tuning later is the sequence that actually produces real results over time. Now, there is an intersection between cardio, muscle, and protein that most gym discussions never address at all properly. The fear that cardio automatically destroys muscle, which is why so many serious lifters avoid it entirely out of caution. This fear is not completely baseless in extreme cases at very high training volumes done with insufficient dietary protein intake. The body can get mixed signals about whether to optimize for endurance efficiency or for muscle retention and growth simultaneously. At very extreme training volumes, this interference becomes genuinely real and measurably impactful on body composition outcomes over time. Elite marathon runners do not walk around with impressive muscle mass for a very clear and understandable biological reason. But the version of cardio most people actually do is nowhere near the volume demands of an elite endurance athlete. Going for a 30-minute walk or cycling at a moderate, comfortable pace is simply not the same physiological situation at all. For the overwhelming majority of gym-going people, moderate cardiovascular work does not meaningfully impair muscle gain or healthy muscle retention. And the protein connection here is critically important and consistently underappreciated in discussions about cardio and muscle mass simultaneously. Higher protein intake during periods that include cardiovascular training provides meaningful and measurable protection for your existing muscle tissue. The amino acid availability that comes from eating adequate protein helps significantly offset the muscle breakdown that harder cardio can cause. This is another key mechanism through which eating more protein than conventional wisdom suggests produces consistently superior body composition outcomes. Your fat loss gets supported by the caloric burn that cardio provides. Your muscle gets protected by the protein you eat. These two tools work powerfully together rather than against each other when protein intake is sufficient and cardio volume is moderate. The mythology separating these things into opposing camps leads people to make consistently suboptimal choices in both directions unnecessarily. They either avoid cardio entirely to protect gains they would not actually lose at moderate volumes with sufficient protein intake, or they do cardio but keep protein intake low, based on the misguided belief that 100 grams is the daily ceiling. Either way, they consistently get worse results than someone who simply understands how these variables interact with each other properly. Here is the honest truth about all of this. Research gives you averages and population-level responses to defined dietary interventions. What it cannot give you is an exact prescription tailored perfectly to your specific genetics, history, and individual lifestyle demands. The best approach is to treat the research as a solid foundation, and then experiment intelligently and honestly on top. Start with what the evidence consistently suggests, between 1.6 and 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight daily. Adjust based on how your body actually responds over several weeks of consistent, honest tracking and genuine careful observation. Some people will find they perform well at the lower end of that range. Others will do clearly better higher up. The point is to use a real evidence-based starting point, rather than a gym myth never supported by actual science. Track your intake seriously for at least 4 to 6 weeks before drawing any firm conclusions about your individual needs. Most people who believe they are eating enough protein significantly underestimate their actual daily intake when they measure carefully and honestly. The gap between what people believe they are consuming and what they actually consume is consistently and surprisingly large in research. Believing you eat 150 grams of protein daily and actually eating 150 grams are very different things without real measurement. This is not a personal failing or character flaw. Estimating food intake without any measurement is genuinely difficult for everyone. But it means many people who feel they have optimized protein are actually still operating well inside a clear deficit zone. The practical recommendation here is straightforward and simple. Track your actual food intake using any basic nutrition app consistently. See what you are genuinely eating daily. Compare it honestly to what research suggests you need for your specific goals. Then make the straightforward adjustment and give your body enough time to produce measurable and observable changes in your composition. This is not complicated at all, but it requires honesty, real consistency, and a willingness to measure instead of estimating forever. The fitness world genuinely loves complexity. It loves elaborate protocols, secret systems, elite techniques, and the one thing that changed everything. But almost every time you honestly pull back the curtain on a truly impressive result, the explanation is boring and obvious. They ate enough protein consistently. They trained with real effort. They slept adequately. They stayed consistent over a long period of time.
That is almost always the actual story underneath the dramatic presentation. The noise around it rarely drove the real result. The 100-gram protein myth is just one piece of a much larger pattern of misinformation baked deeply into fitness culture. It survives because it gets repeated with total confidence by people who learned it from others equally confident and equally wrong. Breaking it requires understanding not just what the research says, but exactly why the myth started and why it still feels true. It feels true because people eating 100 grams of protein can still build some muscle if they train hard enough. The myth works just well enough that most followers never have direct evidence that more would have clearly served them better. You cannot feel the muscle you did not build. You cannot observe the fat loss that simply never happened for you. The counterfactual remains completely invisible. The belief persists because it rarely gets directly falsified by anyone's personal daily experience. This is how almost all fitness mythology survives long-term, not because it produces outstanding results, but because it produces decent ones. Decent feels good enough when you never encounter any direct comparison showing you what actually optimal looks and feels like. The gap between decent and optimal is exactly where most people spend their entire training lives without ever realizing it fully.
And that gap, accumulated across years and years of consistent training, is enormous in both body composition and physical performance terms. More protein is not a complex or cutting-edge intervention requiring special knowledge or access to elite coaching or advanced supplements. It is a fundamental nutritional adjustment that costs almost nothing to implement and produces real, measurable, consistent results over time reliably. The research supports it clearly and consistently. The biology explains precisely why it works across different populations and training contexts. The practical barriers preventing most people from eating enough protein are almost entirely psychological and mythological rather than practical or logistical. The 100-gram ceiling was never real or justified. The kidney fear for healthy people was never scientifically supported at all. The anabolic window was consistently and dramatically overstated by supplement marketing and gym folklore, repeated without any real critical examination. What was always real, always supported by evidence, and always criminally underutilized was simply eating enough protein every single day consistently. Start there with genuine commitment and real consistency. Everything else in your fitness journey will become measurably and noticeably better. The truth about protein is not complicated once you strip away the mythology that has surrounded it for decades.
But it is almost always more nuanced and more powerful than the oversimplified version that fits neatly on any thumbnail.